The Seahawks advance to 5-0 for the first time in franchise history. The NFL does whatever it can to avoid a Week 18, and the Sounders forward Raul Ruidiaz tests positive for COVID-19. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. We are in double digits with the episodes. We also got an upgrade on the camera equipment, so all of you guys that are watching the podcast on YouTube at PTOM Media, if you prefer to watch Around the Sound, all of our video watchers out there have slightly better quality now that we got a slight upgrade in camera equipment, but we get to talk about the crazy Week 5 game between the Seahawks and the Vikings, a game where the Vikings had an over 96% chance to win that football game with less than 2 minutes to go on the clock. The scenes that erupted afterwards, the stop, the drive, we'll talk about all of it in this episode. Absolutely crazy. That game keeps the Seahawks undefeated at 5-0, like I mentioned in the introduction, but we'll get to that in a second. Before that, I do want to make sure that if you're listening to the podcast, to follow me on Twitter and keep up with everything that I'm involved in at the Peyton Thomas, and follow the Instagram for the podcast at Around the Sound Seattle. Don't miss a beat on here at Around the Sound. Make sure you follow that Instagram, and you'll get an opportunity to ask questions and Q&As, or you'll get updated every time there is a new episode of Around the Sound. There's new episodes of Around the Sound every Wednesday and Saturdays if you're not familiar with the show around here. But if you do like the show, you like listening to me, you like Around the Sound, please tell a friend, help me expand this podcast, grow the listener base. I would really appreciate it. And as always, you can watch Around the Sound on YouTube, like I mentioned, at PTOM Media. That's PTHOM Media. Or you can listen to Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. All right, let's hop right into the Seahawks versus the Vikings. This was probably the most entertaining game of the year. It had to be from a neutral standpoint, because at points of this game, it looked like the Vikings were dominating. Then it looked like the Seahawks were dominating. But Hawks now head into the bye week. They have the Week 6 bye at 5-0, so a perfect start through 5 weeks. And it really couldn't come at a better time for the Seahawks this bye week. The last two games from the Dolphins, and the Dolphins' victory from Week 4 looks a little bit stronger after the Dolphins' Week 5 result. We'll talk about that later when we talk about what happened across the NFL. And then this game against the Vikings, the Seahawks looked a little less confident, especially on offense. I don't think Russ was that much worse, but I thought the offensive line started struggling a little bit more in the past 2 games than we saw in the first 3 games. I think we saw a little bit more dropped passes. We didn't see quite as efficiently. The machine was not quite as well oiled in those last 2 games against the Dolphins and the Vikings, 2 teams that have had their own struggles this year, as were the first 3 games. Now, it doesn't mean those first 3 games wasn't close. I mean, the Week 2 game against the Patriots came down to the final play, second to final play, and the Cowboys came down to at least the second to final play, I believe, as well. But anyway, this is a huge moment in the season for the Seahawks to get the bye week, the Week 6, and that's in order to get healthy. If you think about Jamal Adams, you think about Quentin Dunbar, you think about Jordan Brooks, Carlos Hyde, Philip Dorsett, and maybe even Damon Harrison, Snacks Harrison, who the Seahawks had just signed to their practice squad. I would assume he's activated on the active roster before Week 7, but all of those guys are most likely going to be ready and available and fully healthy in that Week 7 game for the Seahawks following the bye week. Getting that extra week of rest is going to be huge for those guys. The Seahawks have only had 2 really significant season-ending injuries, and those 2 being Bruce Irvin and Marquise Blair. Wow, I'm spacing out here, but outside of those 2 injuries, most of the other injuries for the Seahawks have been relatively minor. They've been 2 to 3 week injuries. With this bye week, Quentin Dunbar played a little bit in Week 5. There were a few guys on that list that I mentioned that had played some snaps in Week 5, but we're giving them a rest now. The Seahawks are giving them a rest, and they're going to hopefully come back and be strong when the Seahawks play after the bye in Week 7. Like I said, it's the first time in franchise history the Seahawks are 5-0. They tied the record of 4-0 with that 2013 Super Bowl winning team. That team had lost to the Colts in Week 5 of 2013 to go 4-1. This team, the 2020 Seahawks, do one better and start the season 5-0, the first time in franchise history. And in the NFL, regardless of who you're playing, that is not an easy thing to do. That is a pretty impressive feat for this Seahawks team and Russell Wilson at the helm. So let's talk about the game. The first half, starting off, the Vikings go into the locker room up 13-0. There was a lot of run, pass from the Seahawks. It's what we had been used to seeing when we watched the Seahawks team in maybe 2017 or maybe 2018, where there's a lot of 3-and-outs, there's a lot of sacks, there's no creativity. They weren't putting the ball in Russell Wilson's hands and trying to let him make a great play. That wasn't what was happening. I think the Seahawks were trying to establish the run for a little bit too long. When they would drop back to pass, they weren't putting Russell in a situation to get the ball out quickly. He would hold on to it for really not that long in reality, and would take a sack. There was something like 4 sacks in the first 11 dropbacks for Russell Wilson in the first half, which you got to put most of that on your offensive line. Maybe 1 or 2. I think 1 could have been on Russell, but in reality, it's all about the offensive line and the protection that Russell Wilson has. The Seahawks only picked up 66 yards, total yards between rushing and passing in the first half, and didn't complete a single third down, not only in the first half, but throughout the entire game. And it's crazy that in the NFL today, a team can win a game without completing a single third down. The Vikings also, this is a side note, kind of a tangent, the Vikings also had over 40 minutes, I think a little bit over 40 minutes time of possession. They had the ball for 2/3 of the game. They held the Seahawks to absolutely no third down conversions and still lost the game. So the Seahawks go into the locker room down 13-0. The first time the Seahawks had been shut out in the first half for over 3 years. I think it was 2017 the last time the Seahawks did not get any points before halftime. But the defense sort of kept the Seahawks offense in the game. It could have been a little bit worse. There was some damage control done. I don't think the secondary played a great game, but Minnesota certainly could have done better and racked up at least another field goal or another touchdown, at least one score more to add on to that 13-point game. Because when you go into the locker room 13-0, Seahawks get the ball in the second half. It wasn't a super comfortable lead for Minnesota, and Mike Zimmer and the Vikings knew that going into halftime, that they could have capitalized on a really slow and sputtering Seahawks offense especially, but the defense for a little bit of that first half as well. So let's talk about the second half. Teams come back out of the locker rooms. Seahawks get the ball. They start 3-and-out. They do 3 straight runs, punt the ball away to the Vikings, and this was sort of one of the low points in the game for the Seahawks. The Vikings are getting the ball. It's early third quarter. The offense had been chugging along. The defense hadn't really made any spectacular plays. They had stopped the Vikings once or twice in the first half, but had not really made any spectacular plays. This is when Dalvin Cook goes out. It was sort of a run to the outside. Dalvin Cook kind of started to run backwards toward the sideline to avoid getting tackled. It was a really awkward play, and as soon as he went out of bounds, he started clutching. I think it was his groin or maybe his hamstring. It was an upper leg injury of some sort. Dalvin Cook goes out. He goes into the locker room, and this was one of the big turning points, because not only did Dalvin Cook, who had been averaging over 5 yards per carry in the first half, had a really productive game until he had to go into the locker room. Not only was he now out, but the Vikings were also forced into a third and long scenario that they ultimately weren't able to complete. Had to punt a ball away to the Seahawks. Seahawks get pretty good field position, and this is where sort of the first sequence of fun begins in the game, is when the Seahawks get the ball after this punt. So Seahawks get the ball after this punt. Will Dissly scores a few plays later. Seahawks are back in this thing. It is 13-7 Vikings. Vikings offense comes back out on the field, and a fumble is forced. I think it was Benson Mayowa or somebody. One of the D linemen gets in there and kind of gets to Kirk Cousins' arm. It wasn't a clear play. It was one of those plays where Kirk Cousins looked like he tried to throw a pass. The D lineman did hit his arm. The ball sort of went forward. On the ground, it was picked up by one of the Seahawks players and recovered. There was a little bit of fighting that went on after the play to get the ball. And then after the play was over, it was reviewed and ruled the call on the field was an incomplete pass. It was overturned on review, and the Seahawks got the ball on a fumble. So the Seahawks get the ball on the fumble, then DK Metcalf scores a touchdown. Suddenly, the Seahawks went from down 0-13 to up 14-13. Then on the very next play, the Vikings come back out. Kirk Cousins drops back, looks for a receiver out in the flat. I'm not sure who it was. I think it might have been actually Madison, the backup running back, but KJ Wright drops back, reaches a hand up, and jumps, and it was an incredible leap from KJ Wright to make this one-handed interception on the first play that the Vikings offense got back out on the field. KJ Wright makes this great one-handed interception. He had 2 or 3 opportunities at an interception in Week 4 against the Dolphins. He gets the interception here in Week 5 against the Vikings, and you got to be happy for KJ Wright making plays like that. He's one of the most underappreciated parts of the Seattle defense and has been for the last several years, playing alongside Bobby Wagner. It's easy to do that with Bobby Wagner racking up an insane amount of tackles year after year and making big plays like forced fumbles and a few interceptions. But then Carson has a great run, shoves off Harrison Smith, was really fun to watch. Harrison Smith, one of the best tackling safeties in the NFL. Chris Carson runs it up the gut, shoves him off, and scores. So the Seahawks are up 21-13 after 3 rapid-fire touchdowns. The Seahawks scored those 3 touchdowns in 1 minute and 50 seconds, and that has to be one of the fastest times a team has ever scored 3 consecutive touchdowns or 3 touchdowns in a row. I don't know if I've ever seen a game where a single team has scored 3 consecutive touchdowns in that span of time. It was absolutely incredible of how quickly the Seahawks got the ball back on that initial punt, scored with Disley up until the moment that they got two turnovers and scored with that Chris Carson run. But plenty of credits for Minnesota to rallying after that moment. When the Minnesota Vikings came back out on the field, now down 21-13, it had been the middle of the third quarter by this point. It was a really spirited comeback by a Minnesota team that really could have been down and out. I mean, the Minnesota Vikings coming into this game were 1-3. The only team they had beat was a Texans team, a Houston Texans team that had plenty of problems, already fired their head coach after they played the Minnesota Vikings. And this is a Vikings team that really had, at this point in the game, it seemed like they had their chance to beat the Seahawks, and they blew it. They were up 13-0 at halftime. They had their chance. They had played well. The defense had stopped the Seahawks offense. And at this point in the game, the Vikings offense had lost Dalvin Cook, came back out onto the field, now down 8, and really looked somewhat defeated, but they really rallied. Credit to Alexander Mattison, who is really a carbon copy of Dalvin Cook. It seems like the Vikings have Dalvin Cook and Mattison right behind him. They look very, very similar. The only real difference you could tell is with the numbers, but they run in a very similar way. They're both explosive running backs. Mattison finished the night with 112 yards on 20 carries, a very productive day for him behind that Vikings offensive line, which in reality was able to push aside the Seahawks defensive line for a majority of that game. But Cousins rallied the guys, and the Vikings get 2 touchdowns to Adam Thielen, at my dismay, since I was going against Adam Thielen in one of my fantasy leagues this week, unfortunately. But Adam Thielen picks up 2 touchdowns, and suddenly the Vikings are up 26-21. This is really where the fun of the game kind of lies. So the Vikings get their advantage. They get 2 touchdowns, and so Russ is now down 26-21, comes back out on the field. There's about 5 minutes left in the game now. He throws an interception. It wasn't a great throw by Russ. It was certainly one of the moments where Russ looked human this year. One of the few moments where Russ drops back and doesn't really make the best decision, and he threw it sort of into double coverage. Chris Carson was the intended receiver. He had been forced out of bounds, so even if Chris Carson caught the pass, it would have been in a flag for illegal touching on Chris Carson. Wasn't a great throw. Vikings get the ball and start to run down the clock. They end up on the 6-yard line. They hit the 2-minute warning, and it is 4th and 1. So the Vikings are sitting on the 6-yard line. It's 4th and 1. They're up 5 points, which means Mike Zimmer, the coach of the Minnesota Vikings, has a decision to make. At this point in the game, on this play, the Vikings have a 96% chance to win the game. And if you're Mike Zimmer, you have 2 options. You either kick the field goal and you go up 8 points, which means you give the Seahawks the ball back with 1:45 to go, but you're putting the ball in the hands of Russell Wilson, who very well may charge down the field, score a touchdown, and tie it up with a 2-point conversion. But the big advantage of kicking the field goal is you put yourself up 8 points, which means you can't possibly lose in regulation. The best the Seahawks can do is tie you, and in order to tie you, not only do they have to march down the field with under 2 minutes to go, but they also have to get the ensuing 2-point conversion after that. The other option is to go for it. You go for it on 4th and 1 at the 6. The Seahawks at that moment had only one timeout, and being inside the 2-minute warning, if the Minnesota Vikings had gotten the first down, they would have been able to knee out the ball. Mathematically, it was impossible for the Seahawks to win at that point. So if you get the first down, being the Minnesota Vikings, the game is over. You're able to take knees and fully run out the clock. So right, like I said, you have a 96% chance to win. Kicking a field goal does not change those odds. If you decide to go for it, getting it obviously moves those odds to 99.9, barring some crazy fumble on a QB kneel late in the game. If you miss it, your win percentage goes down to something like 82 or 83%. Here's what Mike Zimmer does. He goes for it. So Mike Zimmer looks at this game, and I don't want to blame this on Mike Zimmer at all, because if I was in the same shoes as Mike Zimmer in this scenario, I would have done the exact same thing. If you are averaging over 5 yards per carry against a Seahawks defensive line that has not yet been able to stop you, they have not yet penetrated past the offensive line and gotten into the backfield to blow up more than 1 or 2 of your carries throughout the entire game, you're sitting on a 4th and 1. You're going to send your big bodies out there. You're going to send Mattison out there, who's had a great game rushing the ball on the ground, and you're going to assume that you can pick up that 1 yard. That's exactly what he did. He went with the sort of predictable play call, which is rush it up the middle. Mattison gets the ball. Kirk Cousins hands it off to him, and Benson Mayowa shoves off the guard of the Minnesota Vikings. Sort of, it wasn't really in the backfield because it was kind of at the line of scrimmage, shoves off the guard that he was on, gets to Mattison at the line of scrimmage, stops him right in his tracks, and the Seahawks make the stop. They stop the Vikings short of the first down line. It's a turnover on downs, and Russ takes over the ball on his own 6-yard line. So he needs a 94-yard drive. I think there's about a minute 45, I think, left in the game at this point. So now the Hawks are looking for the MVP drive. And up to this point in the game, Russ hadn't had a terrible game. He did throw that one interception, but it hadn't been what I would call an MVP caliber game. I think in every point this year, up until this moment right now, in weeks 1 through 4, there was a point in the game, if it wasn't the whole game, where Russell Wilson was making his case for MVP. He was making throws that not very many other quarterbacks in the league can make. He's commanding the team and commanding the offense like not very many other quarterbacks in the NFL can do. In week 5, in this game, he gets the ball, and up until this point, he had not, in this game, made his case for MVP yet. This was the drive of this game where he really made his case for MVP. He faced an early first down. It looked like it could have been over right there. DK Metcalf finds his way open for a big reception. That got the Seahawks down to the 40 or 30-yard line of the Vikings. The Seahawks were able to somewhat take their time as they managed the clock well, and there was a lot of incompletions. Most of the completions ended up out of bounds as well, so it didn't really run the clock. The result is the Seahawks end up on about the 10-yard line of the Minnesota Vikings, so it's 1st and goal with about 30 or 40 seconds to go. DK Metcalf has a chance to score a touchdown on 2nd down. It was a tough play. He got the feet down in the corner of the end zone, started to go down, and when he hit the ground, the ball was popped free, was an incompletion. So 3rd down was another incompletion, sort of a fade into the corner for DK Metcalf. 4th down, last play of the game. There's 30 seconds left, and essentially the game comes down to this because the Seahawks miss it, the Vikings come out and take a knee and end the game. If the Seahawks make it, it's going to be really difficult for Kirk Cousins to work back out onto the field with under 20 seconds and try to score. So Seahawks, 4th down, snap the ball, DK Metcalf crossing route in the end zone, and I think a lot of Seahawks fans or a lot of people watching that game, knowing the connection that Russell Wilson has with DK Metcalf, they almost knew that DK Metcalf was going to get the ball in this scenario. Russ fires a perfect throw in there. DK Metcalf makes a pretty good grab in the end zone, kind of crossing between the zones of 2 members of the Vikings secondary, and the Seahawks now are up 1 point, 27-26 in the game with about 20 seconds to go. The Seahawks tried to go for 2 to go up 3 to make sure that a field goal could not beat them. They fail the 2-point conversions. They remain up 1. Vikings come back out on the field, try to run 1 or 2 plays. Eventually, it was a similar play. The game ended with a fumble, a Kirk Cousins fumble. It was very similar to the play in the 3rd quarter where a D lineman got into Kirk Cousins' face, hit his arm, and the refs ruled that the arm wasn't going in a forward motion, and therefore it was not an incomplete pass and a fumble instead. The Seahawks get the fumble and go out, take a knee, and win the game. So what do we kind of take out of this victory? What can we take out of the Seahawks victory in Week 5? That they somehow escaped this game where they were almost doomed to lose when the Vikings were going for it on the other end at 4th and 1 against a D-line that had not yet stopped them. It's clear that Russell Wilson doesn't really like cold weather. If you look back at the stats for the amount of games that Russell Wilson has played in sunny weather or warm weather or in dome environments like in New Orleans or other places that have maybe an open closed roof, the stats don't lie. Russell Wilson does not play quite as well in cold weather or in rainy weather generally as he does in warmer weather or in indoors. This game, he put up 217 yards through the air, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. So he's not really lighting the world on fire with those statistics, but it certainly wasn't a bad game. If you watch the way Russell Wilson played, there wasn't that much he could do in the first half. He had absolutely no time from the offensive line, and Pete Carroll and Schottenheimer didn't really put the ball in Russell Wilson's hands until the second half. They tried to establish the run. Like I said, it looked a little bit like the 2017-2018 Seahawks offense, where Pete Carroll tried to establish the run for a little bit too long, and he finds himself in halftime or in the third quarter in this sort of deficit where he decides that he has to now put the ball in Russell Wilson's hands and give him a chance to win the game. And on that final drive, that final drive keeps Russell Wilson in the lead, in the driver's seat, easily for the MVP. Aaron Rodgers had a bye week this week, so he didn't really get a chance to match Russell Wilson's performance. Now the Seahawks do get the bye week. Aaron Rodgers will be able to go back out in week 6 and match that performance, or at least attempt to match these string of performances for Russell Wilson. But I mean, Russell Wilson is on pace for 61 touchdowns right now on the season. With 3 touchdowns in this game, he's now on pace for 61 touchdowns over the course of the 2020 season. The current record in the NFL for touchdown passes in a season is Peyton Manning with 55. Russell Wilson is on pace to beat that record by 6 touchdowns, which would be absolutely insane. Again, I don't know late in the season how likely it is for Russell Wilson to keep up that pace, because you haven't even entered those division games yet, which a lot of times those division games can be gritty, low scoring, slow the game down types. It depends on the team you're playing, but it does seem like a lot of those division games do end up that way. So we'll have to see what happens. But if Russell Wilson is able to stay on this pace, 61 touchdowns in 16 games would be an incredible, incredible record, an incredible rate of touchdowns per game if we got to that point at the end of the season. But I do want to move on to sort of the darker part of Russell Wilson's game, and it wasn't really Russell Wilson, it was the offensive line. The offensive line really is what kept the Seahawks from being able to convert on third down, whether it was running on third and short or passing on third and medium and third and long, which they faced quite a few of those third and medium and third and long situations. But the Seahawks did not complete a third down conversion the entire game. The offensive line sort of got it together in the second half and definitely got it together on that last drive. Russell Wilson made some great plays, but I thought he also had some more protection. Even when the Vikings did blitz, they had a little bit more protection on that final drive. But like I mentioned earlier in the episode, 4 sacks on the first 11 passing attempts that Russell Wilson dropped back on. That's not good. I mean, it seemed like Russ was getting killed every single time he would drop back to pass in the first half. And again, that was the story of the 2017-2018 Seattle Seahawks offense. The only difference that we saw in this game is Pete Carroll and Schottenheimer were able to get out of that perpetual run pass, that 4 sacks in the first 11 dropbacks. They were able to get out of that mold, that offensive mentality, and able to put the ball in Russell Wilson's hands. If it was the 2017 or 2018 offense, the Seahawks easily lose that game and don't make such a spirited comeback. It just wouldn't be possible unless you put the ball in the hands of Russell Wilson and trust him to create and make big plays for your team. Let's talk about the other side of the ball. Another group of players I thought had definitely their share of struggles in this game was the secondary. It was another game for the Seahawks secondary where the opposing quarterback, Kirk Cousins in this case, was able to somewhat slice apart the defense with ease, or at least the secondary. Trey Flowers was thrust into the secondary again. Quinton Dunbar, who had been battling injuries, came back for this game. He picked up a knock in the first or second quarter, which made Trey Flowers have to play that second corner spot for the rest of the game. And overall, it was just a lot of lapses in coverage. There were certainly some plays where the secondary, I felt, could have made a better play on the ball or kept the Vikings receiver from getting possession, but it really doesn't help when the defensive line is giving up 5 yards per carry, which means you can't play nickel and dime sets. Nickel and dime sets are 5 DBs or 6 DBs, when normally your normal 4-3 formation defensively is only 4 defensive backs. If you're able to play those nickel and dime sets, get more defensive backs out on the field, it's easier to defend against the pass. But when the defensive line is giving up 5 yards per carry, it's really, really difficult to defend against the pass when the Vikings are throwing out 3 or 4 wide receiver sets and you only have 4 DBs back there trying to defend against it. The defensive line also really wasn't threatening Kirk Cousins on a lot of Kirk Cousins' dropbacks, which means the secondary is having to defend for 4 or 5 seconds, and that's just impossible. You're essentially leaving your secondary out to dry there. And there's 3 tiers to an NFL defense, regardless of whether you run a 4-3, which means 4 defensive linemen and 3 linebackers, or a 3-4, which is the opposite. But regardless, there's 3 tiers to NFL defenses. There's the defensive line, there's the linebacking core, and then there's the secondary. And all 3, each tier playing well helps the others play well. And there's been a lot of blame thrown on the defensive line this year, and I've been very critical of the defensive line. There's been a lot of blame thrown on the secondary this year, and I've been very critical of the secondary at times this year for the Seattle Seahawks. But you have to understand that each tier playing well and doing their part helps the other tier. If the defensive line is getting the quarterback in 2, 3, 4 seconds and at least putting pressure on him, you can't expect your defensive line to come up with more than 5 sacks in a game. Even 5 is an incredible number for one game. It takes a really lapse of concentration from the opposing offensive line to give up 5 sacks, but you expect your defensive line to at least pressure the quarterback after a few seconds and not leave you defending for 5 seconds every play, every time the quarterback drops back. You expect your defensive line to stop those running plays, allowing you to play those nickel sets or play those dime sets where you're better equipped to defend against the pass. I don't think there was a lot of complementary defense being played between the 3 tiers, between the defensive line and the secondary especially. Those guys, they go back and forth. When the secondary plays better, the defensive line plays better, and vice versa. I don't think there was a lot of complementary football being played between those 2 groups, position groups, in this game against the Vikings. Overall, the Hawks now move into their bye week. They have a really tough stretch after the bye week. They play all 3 of the other NFC West teams, in addition to the Bills. Those are their first 4 games coming out of the bye week. I'm not sure what exact order those 4 are in, but you get the 3 divisional opponents and the Bills, who are right now 4-0. They play the Titans on Tuesday night, but at the time of recording this, they are 4-0, but they are set to kick off in just a little bit. So they could be 4-1 or 5-0, depending on how that game goes against the Titans. And so it's time for those guys on the Seahawks. Like I mentioned, those guys at the start of the podcast, the Jamal Adams, the Dunbars, the Snacks Harrisons, the Jordan Brooks, all those guys to get healthy and allow the Seahawks to make a push through this mid-season once you come out of the bye week. So let's talk about a little bit of what else happened around the NFL. I'm sure most of you listening had probably heard about that Dak Prescott injury, a really, really ugly injury in Dallas for Dak Prescott. His bone was essentially sticking out of the side of his ankle. It was really gruesome. It was one of those plays where if you were watching the broadcast, and I was, you see it happen and you almost feel sick to yourself. So prayers up to Dak Prescott in his recovery and his return. He's a very fun player to watch in the league, and I hope to see him back next year. I think the Cowboys did rule that he will be out for the remainder of the season, which leaves the quarterbacking duties of the Dallas Cowboys up to Andy Dalton, the Ginger. The Ginger makes his return. Andy Dalton is now quarterbacking the Dallas Cowboys. The 49ers get absolutely whacked by the Miami Dolphins. And like I mentioned, I think I mentioned this really early on in the episode, but this makes me feel a little bit better about the Seahawks win against the Dolphins. The fact that the game was so tight. I mean, the Dolphins have now played the Bills really tight. Now, they lost that game, but they played the Bills really well. Only lost by, I think, a field goal. They played the Seahawks pretty well, and now they whack the 49ers, and the 49ers are really, really injured, but they had Jimmy Garoppolo back for this game. Jimmy Garoppolo started the game 7 for 17 with maybe 70-some yards and 2 interceptions. The 49ers benched Jimmy Garoppolo halfway through this game. They bring out C.J. Beathard or something, and the 49ers ultimately got smacked in Santa Clara by the Miami Dolphins. A huge statement win by the Miami Dolphins, and really, if you want to call it a statement loss for the 49ers, the 49ers now sitting at 2-3. They had Kittle back this game, they had Garoppolo, and they have plenty of other injury problems. The defensive line is not the same and not going to be the same for the rest of the year, but for a team that was in the Super Bowl last year, a 2-3 start, the way Jimmy Garoppolo played in Week 5 against the Dolphins, really not looking good for the 49ers over there. The Cardinals and the Rams both picked up victories against really not real football teams. I think the Cardinals played the Jets and the Rams played the Washington football team, name redacted. But an interesting stat is through the first 5 games, the Rams are now 4-1. All 4 of their wins have come against NFC East teams. So the Rams got the probably easiest part of their schedule out of the way. Their lone loss coming in Buffalo, which is a really tough game. It's the only real team that the Rams have played. Remember, the Buffalo Bills were up 28-3 in that game. The Rams came all the way back, were winning. Josh Allen, final drive, wins it for the Bills, but the Rams played well in that game, but their other 4 wins, none of those 4 wins for the Rams are really that impressive. All 4 of the NFC East teams, which really aren't that good, between the Cowboys, the Eagles, the Washington football team, name redacted, and who am I forgetting? The New York Giants, who aren't a real football team either. So we'll have to see what the Rams do now that they are going to start playing real football teams going forward. It should be interesting to watch. In the AFC, the Chiefs were upset by a strong performance from Josh Jacobs and Derek Carr of the Las Vegas Raiders. The Chiefs, the Super Bowl champions, reigning Super Bowl champions, pick up their first loss. Patrick Mahomes over there picks up his first loss. The Falcons start 0-5, lose another game. Really a miserable start to the season from the Falcons, a team that really should be playing better, especially on the defensive side. Matt Ryan's been pretty good, but Dan Quinn is now fired. They also fired their GM, Dimitroff. So Dan Quinn is now back out in looking for a job. Pete Carroll was asked this week whether he would bring Dan Quinn back. He kind of avoided the question. It seems like a long shot to bring in Dan Quinn, especially since Dan Quinn is probably capable of getting a head coaching role elsewhere in the league at some point. Let's talk about the NFL's COVID changes now. I know we'd get to this in the episode at some point. The NFL was forced to move Denver, New England. That was the game set for Monday afternoon. Don't be confused with the Monday night game. Denver, New England was supposed to be played on Sunday. Due to tests late in the week last week, they moved the game back to Monday as a precautionary measure. Unfortunately, there were more positive tests over the weekend for, I believe, the New England Patriots, which forced the NFL to move all kinds of stuff around. They moved 8 or 9 games around from different teams to make the bye weeks work. Neither Denver or New England had their bye week yet, which means it was possible to move a bunch of stuff around for these 2 teams to have the week 4 bye and essentially make sure that they would be able to not miss any games by the time we got past week 17. The NFL, here's the full list of all the stuff that they moved. It's Denver versus New England, so the game was supposed to be played in week 5, is now to week 6. Jets versus Miami from week 10 to week 6. Jets versus Chargers from week 6 to week 11. Jacksonville versus Chargers from week 8 to week 7. Man, that's a mouthful. The Chargers versus Denver from week 11 to week 8. The Chargers versus the Dolphins from week 7 to week 10. And the Dolphins versus Denver to week 6, or from week 6 to week 11, excuse me. Now, that was a laundry list, but what does all that mean? It means that the NFL is going to do everything mathematically possible to avoid adding in an 18th week. They are going out on this massive limb, assuming that they can get through the season without having to postpone any games and move them to a week 18. It seems really, really far-fetched, especially with how many teams are struggling at this point in the year, with how many teams are already past their bye week and could get COVID-19. The Packers had their bye week this week, and I think 3 other teams had their bye week this week. But if any of those teams get COVID cases and have to have a game postponed, there's nothing else the NFL can do than add in a week 18 late in the season. They're delaying it. but I think they're delaying the inevitable. I think eventually the NFL are going to have to add that extra week, but at least for now, assuming that Tennessee Buffalo plays Tuesday night. Now, by the time this episode is up, you will know because the episode is going to go up on Wednesday, but I'm recording it Tuesday evening, which means if Tennessee Buffalo gets through without any problems, the NFL is still treading water in this 17-week season. They're still going to get through. They're still scheduled to get through all of the games by the point we get to week 17. We'll have to watch and see what happens. I have a hard time believing the NFL are going to be able to ride this wave through, another 12 weeks of the NFL season. Seems really far-fetched, but we'll have to see what happens. Shifting into some Sounders news, it's the last thing we're going to cover on Around the Sound today. Raul Ruidiaz, forward for the Seattle Sounders, has tested positive for COVID-19 while out on international duty with Peru. He was slated to miss 4 or 5 games for the Sounders anyway, being on international duty. So from a Sounders fan point of view, it's probably a good time for Raul Ruidiaz to get COVID. He'll be disappointed to miss some important international games with the Peruvian national team. They've got World Cup qualifiers going on down there in South America. So Raul Ruidiaz will be disappointed to miss a few of those games. He's now isolating away from the Peru team. He'll have to isolate for something like 10 days. He might return to the team for 1 or 2 games before now having to isolate again before he returns back to his MLS squad, rejoining the Sounders late in their season. Another note, the Sounders game that was scheduled for this Wednesday against the Colorado Rapids has been delayed and postponed due to yet another positive test for the Colorado Rapids. For those of you that don't really follow the MLS that closely, the Rapids will now have missed 7 straight MLS games due to COVID-19. A really tough situation over there for the Rapids. It's similar to the NFL where they're going to have to find a way to make up all those games, but the MLS is really starting to run out of time in their regular season. You have teams in the MLS that have played 17 of their 23 games, and the Rapids are now sitting at 13 of their 23 games played. They're going to keep dropping, or teams that have already played 17 games are going to continue to gain ground on the Colorado Rapids. It's going to be tough to see the Colorado Rapids try to make up all of those games before the end of the year, but we'll have to see what happens on that front as well. Man, COVID's just screwing everything up. That's been kind of the mantra of 2020, but it continues now into the middle of October, and I don't think it's going to end anytime soon before the end of the year, but we're getting sports in 2020, so compared to where we were at in, say, April or May, you can't look back at this and say we could have done it that much better given the situation that all of these leagues, the MLS, the NFL, has been thrown into, but that's all we got for today. So we'll analyze a little bit more of the Hawks game-winning drive, of Russell's connection with DK Metcalf. We got some more stuff to go over on Saturday. We should have more news then as well, as the news cycle always keeps on churning. There's always things to talk about. So until then, until Saturday, thanks for listening and stay safe.